Hi, I'm Tim, welcome to our channel, and thanks for logging on. An offhand comment on a forum recently suggested that there was no comparing Rolex to Grand Seiko, and instead Grand Seiko should be equated to Rolex's Tudor sub-brand. Well, I'm testing the theory today to see whether a Tudor GMT is really a proper matchup against a Grand Seiko GMT, and I'm going to attempt to conclude whether Grand Seiko warrants comparison to Tudor or Rolex. Let's discuss the Tudor Heritage Black Bay GMT. This is a watch that's relatively fresh in our memory because it debuted last year, 2018 at Baselworld. It was a bit of a surprise because I would not have expected Rolex to tolerate Tudor's launching of its own Pepsi GMT. The same year, Rolex launched a Pepsi GMT to inaugurate a new generation of its famed dual-time pilot's watch. That said, they are very different watches, both in aesthetic and capability. Now, the first thing you notice about the Tudor GMT is that it's bigger and it's blockier and it's bulkier than both the Rolex GMT and the Grand Seiko. They are very different watches. As far as dual-time watches go, you could not be more distinct without selecting two different complications or product classes. Rotating bezel, matte dial, simple case construction, large dive watch inflected proportions. This is really an interesting watch because although it has some of the imagery of the Rolex Pilot's Pepsi, this is really a Tudor Black Bay dive watch that's been repurposed with a different movement and a different bezel to operate as a GMT. That said, it wears fairly easily on a 16cm circumference wrist. There's nothing particularly ungainly about the watch. It's an easy 41mm to wear, so it's not huge, and though 14.7mm thick, it's almost identical to the Grand Seiko in that regard. 50mm, I should say, across the wrist. The 200-meter water-resistant watch is 22mm between the lugs. A few different ways to get this watch. You can get into a Black Bay GMT new from a dealer for as little as $3,625 US if you buy it on the textile strap. The example you see right here, $39.50 on a full bracelet. It's a fairly easy watch to wear on a 16cm circumference wrist. I do think once your wrist starts getting any smaller than 14.5cm circumference, it might begin to dwarf your forearm. So don't get any smaller than that. The timepiece is lovely, and I do mean that sincerely. You get a lot of watch, a timepiece that would have been considered more substantial than Rolex timepieces of only about 15-16 years ago. The links of the bracelet are redoubtable, although there will be mixed opinions on the faux rivet style. It is designed to evoke a little bit of a vintage vibe, and the same can be said of the dial as well as the crown. So if nothing else, it is consistent with the mission of the Heritage Black Bay collection. Oyster-style bracelet, satin finished with the exception of the outer faces, removable links fixed by screws, and a remarkably substantial clasp. This is not the foil-like stamped Rolex clasp of the 90s. This is a rather robust folding clasp. All of the components feel substantial. They feel either machined or stamped from very thick sheets. You'll also note that there are ceramic pin snaps inside and outside the facing of the buckle component. So this is designed to maintain its tolerances over time, and you can hear it snap shut even before you lock the clamshell. There is a fine adjustment set up inside. As you can see, I can change the anchoring point of the bracelet within the clasp. That's how Rolex bracelets used to be. You used to be able to change the anchoring. You can still do it. It's not as obvious as Rolex doesn't drill straight through the clasp anymore. Of course, on the underside, big gaps to vent the wrist. It's a sports watch bracelet through and through. Solid case back, and a case that is both massive and modern and evocative of vintage in a few respects. First, you can see that lovely bevel, mechanically applied, yes, but it's a nod to the era when Rolex and Tudor both shared cases, and they were the Rolex cases right up until the late 1980s. You would see that hand-laid bevel on both cases. High polish on the flanks, satin finish on the hoods of the lugs to match the bracelet. And then you have a 48-click bezel that is bidirectional rotating. It is a pilot-style bezel, the idea being that you will use the 24-hour hand already set to Greenwich Mean Time, and then line up the bezel, the index, and offset using the GMT offset for the local airport or port of destination. So in theory, you could display 3 time zones on the dial, as long as one of them, the 24-hour hand, is Greenwich Mean Time. The dial base is matte finish to reduce glare. You can see that there is a domed sapphire over the top. It does feature applique indices, so it's not a printed dial. Impressive features for a watch in this price range, sub $4,000. And there's a lovely vintage evocative chapter ring outboard. You can see that the snowflake hands are present, so the watch is a little bit of a hybrid of the Pepsi GMT, the 1960s through mid-70s Tudor Snowflake Submariner dials, and then you can see earlier pre-Crown Guard Tudor Submariner form on the case flank, with the pre-1968 Tudor Rose on the crown and the post-1968 Tudor Shield on the dial. Of course, you have a couple of functions courtesy of the manufacturer movement, including stop seconds and a second time zone that can be set independently. You can even set the date forward or backwards as you cross the international date line. Underneath the case back, Tudor manufacturer caliber MT5652 automatic winding 70-hour power reserve, stop seconds 12 and 24-hour format dual time, COSC certified Swiss chronometer. It has a full balance bridge with a free sprung index for shock resistance and a silicone hairspring for anti-magnetism, 200 meters water resistant inside this case. So this is a very capable watch, offering a lot more than Rolex watches of just a generation ago. Let's talk about the Grand Seiko. The first thing you notice about the Grand Seiko is that in form, it is very different from the Tudor. They're not that different in nominal diameter, as the Grand Seiko is 40 millimeters, the Tudor's 41, but there's a world of difference in how they wear those dimensions on the wrist. My 16 centimeter circumference wrist will tell you that this watch looks as though it's been pared down. It looks like a more compact and more elegant case. Of course, this is the 44GS case, born in 1967. It's been one of the signature styles of Grand Seiko since 1967. Variations known as the polyhedron on the 44GS remain very much in the catalog today. It's a fascinating and nuanced form. We'll talk about it in detail in a moment. The watch is almost as thick as the Tudor at 14.5 versus 14.7 millimeters. Lug to lug, two different ways to measure this watch. The actual case is fairly compact at 46.3 millimeters. But if you measure the solid end links of the bracelet from side to side, you wind up with a span across the wrist of a more substantial 49.7, which is almost exactly the 50 millimeters of the Tudor. The one major difference proportionally is that the lug spacing here is 19 millimeters versus 22 millimeters on the Tudor. We'll zoom out a little bit more so you can get a sense of this watch in proportion on my 16 centimeter circumference wrist. Okay, you know my wrist size, now you know this watch. Let's talk a little bit about the detailing. The bracelet is handsome, and I can't pick between the two. I can't tell you which one is more solid. I do appreciate that there's no pseudo rivet pattern. The bracelet isn't appearing to be vintage inspired in any distinct way. The 44GS case is a heritage design. It's not a retro watch. This is something that's been offered more or less on and off since 1967, so it's never been dead to be revived like the GMT Tudor. You'll also note that, as with the Tudor, all of the removable links fixed by screws, no pin sleeves here. These watches don't treat themselves like entry-level pieces. Handsome finish. You can see there's both satin and polish to the bracelet. It's when we get to the case that the game changes. This case is entirely hand finished. You've heard of the Zaratsu polishing method, and it's not quite the Japanese sword polishing that some marketers make it out to be. That it's not. What it is tin plate polishing against a German-Swiss Zalitz machine long ago imported to Japan. The now foremost practitioner of this type of finish is Grand Seiko. You'll scarcely find this type of finish in Europe anymore. So the black polish, optically smooth, is laid down by hand, pushing the case directly against the spinning tin wheel. The result is that black style polish, but not on a screw, not on a small movement component as you'll see in Switzerland, but on a component the size of a case, and it's millimetrically the same from side to side, from facet to facet. This is done all by eye, hand, and experience. That's a hand-finished watch. You get to the dial and you realize there's even more. The Owatayama dial, designed to resemble the snow scatter pattern at dawn on the peak of Mount Iwate in northern Japan, outside the Shizuku Ishii watch studio where mechanical Grand Seiko watches are made. So you have that lovely scatter pattern in a multi-layer lacquered maroon. The best way to describe it is somewhere between red and brown. It's exquisite. There's some gilt detailing to the dial with the golden chaptering outboard with the 24 hours, and then the GMT stamped down at 6 o'clock. All of the hands and the indices are diamond polished and finished manually, micro-mechanically finished by an artisan who only completes these components. And the same is true of the aperture for the date. This is a hand-finished dial. So you have a hand-finished case, an exquisite hand-finished dial, and then a hand-regulated movement. And an interesting feature on this case back, this watch is a 2016 limited edition of 500 pieces. So it's very special. In some ways, it's the predecessor of the later and better known Peacock. What you're looking at is a anodized, I'm going to open up the clasp, try to get a better view, an anodized titanium rotor. And it too has been designed with the peak of Mount Iwate in mind. At dawn, you see all colors ranging from purple to gold, and you can see how this titanium rotor has been entirely transformed. No two are exactly alike among the 500 of these watches created. The movement is the automatic 9S86, 36,000 vibrations per hour, 6-position adjusted, guaranteed accurate to no worse than -3 + 5 seconds per day, which does exceed the Swiss COSC. And the Swiss COSC is a test in only 5 positions. This watch is regulated in 6 positions. 55-hour power reserve, 100 meters water resistant. It features the 12 24-hour format, and it features the hacking seconds. So you've got quite a few toys here, and all of them beautifully executed. So let's talk about the advantages of these watches. The Tudor first. We began with the Tudor. We'll start our advantage segment with the Tudor. Okay, value. When the Grand Seiko was new, it cost $6,400. You can still buy the Tudor new for between $3,625 and $3,950. Now, significantly, the watch holds its value well, and on a full bracelet, these sell for up to $4,800 pre-owned. So it's an impressive store of value for the junior Rolex brand. I'll also mention that the watch features lume. The Grand Seiko doesn't. You can look at this watch and read it at night. Advantage. The bezel. You can use the bezel to judge a third time zone, but if you're able to estimate minutes, you can actually use it as a timing bezel too. If you just imagine that 6 is 15, 12 is 30, 18 is 45, you can also use this as a timing bezel, just as long as you remember it's not a dive bezel. Don't use it that way. So on that basis, advantage Tudor. Now, value, we just talked about it. $3,625 gets you into one of these on a strap, and they hold their value well, whereas if you want to buy the Grand Seiko pre-owned today, that watch sells for between $8,500 and $9,000. Let's talk about water resistance. Right here, you have 200 meters versus 100 meters, and a few tech advantages in the movement where the 70-hour power reserve surpasses the 55 of the Grand Seiko, and you have that anti-magnetic silicone hairspring for anti-magnetism in those homes and offices that today feature speakers, subwoofers, high-powered electronics every which way. Advantage Tudor. And I should mention a full balance bridge and a free-sprung index for shock resistance, features the Grand Seiko does not have. Now, the Grand Seiko. Okay, rarity. This is a timepiece made in 500 pieces, and whereas Tudor is going to make hundreds of thousands of watches, Grand Seiko is going to make tens of thousands of watches. So 500 pieces, that is far, far less common than any Tudor watch, especially the Black Bay GMT, which has become fairly common. Let's talk about warranty. Versions of this watch are still sold. Not this exact model, but in this day and age, you get a 2-year warranty from Tudor, and if you were to buy the 2019 equivalent of this watch, you would get a 3-year warranty. So Grand Seiko backing its watches with a 3-year warranty. Still not 5 years like Rolex, but better than Tudor. Let's talk about elegance of form. This case is incredible. The grace of those curves, the sharpness of those facets, and the fact that despite the 1 millimeter size disparity, the Grand Seiko appears far more compact and tidy on the wrist than the blockish Tudor. Let's also talk about the dial quality. It is staggering. Not just the Iwateyama dial with spectacular lacquer form, color, and translucence, but also the hands, also the indices, all of that handmade. This is a work of art inside and out. This watch is not just about its case and its rotor. It's very much about its dial, and on that count, advantage Grand Seiko. Finally, Tudor only attests that this watch meets the COSC standard, which is -4 + 6 per 24 hours. This watch is regulated to meet a standard of -3 + 5. It's a small distinction, but percentage-wise, it's a fairly big one. And finally, the display caseback. No, you can't see much of the 9S86, but you can see that sensational rotor, and it's an Eiffel. What do I think in the end? I think Grand Seiko needs to trade up and find itself a better rival. Tudor offers a ton for the money, but in terms of overall refinement and craft art, Grand Seiko deserves that Rolex comparison. In fact, if I were Grand Seiko, I would be looking forward to a matchup with something like the Rolex GMT Master or the Explorer 2 in the very near future. For me, there's simply no comparison. Hand-regulated movement, hand-finished case, handmade dial, all of that exquisite in ways that the rather industrial Tudor, though an honest value, can never achieve. This is a truly hand-finished and handmade work of art that you can happen to wear on your wrist and use to tell time. Tell me, which one of these do you prefer, and does Grand Seiko need to trade up to a rivalry with Rolex? Let me know in the comments below.